So welcome everybody to our series Wrestling with God and Men with Rabbi Steve Greenberg. I'm Miriam Kabakov, Ishel's Executive Director, and I'm really happy to see all of you here. This fourth session is entitled Gender and Identity, the Transformation of Difference. The tradition understands bodies as ordinarily either male or female. However, reality proves more slippery than the binary frame articulates. We will explore an array of texts that attest to multiple gray areas and at moments, with some anxiety, actively highlights the power of difference. Okay, Steve, take it away.
So this is a really exciting and challenging session. I would have to say that among all the sessions, this is the one that I find the most challenging and the most having enormous potential opportunities. But it's one that actually plays out in Jewish thinking in a number of ways. It also plays out in moral thinking in a number of ways. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a review of the last couple of sessions just in a minute, just to, situate us, and then I'm going to dive in. So last week we were introduced to Bar Kapara, who's the rabbinic stand-up comedian who offered our second rationale. And he was invited in the last minutes, if you remember, to Rabbi Judah, Judah the Prince's son's wedding, and he entertained the crowd with some racy puns. The significant one was, "What is toiva, ma toiva, toa taba, you wander because of this." The image of a man wandering from his marital bed looking for male company in the local Roman brothels becomes visible in this frame. We then compared this wedding humor story in the Darim to a text in Yevamot dealing with same-sex behavior of women. Rav Huna says that he doesn't let his daughters sleep together in the same bed. Why? Gemara wants to know. Well, we discover that he's not worried about them having sex. That was the first option, but actually, no, he's not. He's worried instead about their enjoying a warm body and getting used to that feeling and then being more susceptible to the seduction of lusty men. So both male and female homosexual desire, it looks like, complicates, potentially undermines heterosexual marriage. In Yevamot, single women who cuddle are made more susceptible to licentious men. Wives who might have girlfriends will become less interested in their husbands. And in Nedarim, we discovered that married men can sleep with men and become disinterested in their wives. In other words, homosexuality poses threats to normative expectations around marriage and relationship. The assumption is that God makes everyone capable of desirous heterosexual union for the purpose of ongoing life and family. However, some people, it's clear, have an expansive, voracious sexual desire, and they refuse to control it. The problem of homosexuality, then, in those first two rationales, seems to be one of excess. We will explore in this next portrayal homosexuality not as excess, out of control, but it's chaos. Today's rationale focuses on boundary blurring, category confusion, themes that will hark back a little bit to our session on creation. So if you remember, in the very beginning, before the rationales began, we actually kind of explored creation as a bit of the Hebrew Bible to claim that order is how life works, how creation works, how God creates. And separations of light and dark, day and night, sea, and land, waters above and below, and finally male and female, is how the world is made. And not only is how the world is made, but it's how we are asked to actually acknowledge that order and see in it, a kind of divine handprint. We do it with Havdalah. And it's not, this is normative for us. We don't even think about it, but Hamavdil, why do we say after Shabbat? Ben Kodesh l'chol, ben Or l'choshet, ben Yisrael l'amim. These distinctions between light and dark, day and night, Shabbat and the weekday, Israel and nations, are significant for the structure of the social world we live in. Now, we're going to find out it's a little bit more complicated, but fundamentally it is true, right? That these are the frameworks, these binary frameworks are frameworks of existence. We even say it when we do the bracha after using the bathroom, is that there are nikavim, chalulim, chalulim, these different vessels. And it's, if one that should be open should be closed, or should be closed should be open, we couldn't stand before you. In other words, order and structure and on-off switches make the world work. I mean, the entire electrical system outside our bodies and inside our bodies function with zeros and ones. I mean, the order of the universe is what makes it alive. And so chaos is portrayed as a problematic. It's problematic, we've seen it in the creation story a little bit. It's problematic because order undermines the structures, the reliable structures of life. Exactly how order and chaos do a dance, we'll explore as we go on. The text that highlights our question of, why should sex between men be problematic as disordered? By the way, that is how the Catholic Church refers to homosexual relationships, as disordered, which is why they are highly creationist in their theory of both reproduction and life. And for that very reason, homosexual relations are disordered and trouble. They are not the way God intended the orders to work. Well, Avram Ibn Ezra, Spanish commentator, in the early Middle Ages, says the following on our text: since the male was created to act and the female to be acted upon, the verse prohibiting male intercourse reminds us not to overturn the word of God. So his rationale, not reproduction and not problematic, it's going to mess up marriage, was simply that gay sex is a problem of disorder. It's a problem of messing up creation. Men are penetrators, women are penetratees, and for a man to be penetrated is to muck up the order and to, now you see how he describes it. It's to overturn the word of God. Meaning the orders of nature are seen as not only physical, but in a way, reality commands in this scenario. And so messing up God's ordered plan is a bad idea. Now, when did humans mess up the order? So this idea of when human beings mess up the order, it's a big problem, takes us to another referent that is used in probably the harshest way, probably the harshest text around homosexuality appears in these materials on the story of the flood and the story of Noah. So I want to kind of review quickly. We're not going to spend too much time here, but the story of Noah is a story of order and chaos in a certain way. Like the Lord saw how wicked man's wickedness was on earth and how every plan devised by his mind was nothing but evil, and the Lord regretted he'd made man on earth. His heart was sad, and he's going to blot out the human being. In other words, something is wrong. Human beings are doing behaviors that are undermining the divine plan. Divine plan is ordered, and human beings are disordering it. It's even marked in the text. If you look, I don't have this yellowed out. I could have. The earth became corrupt in the middle of that paragraph before God. It was filled with lawlessness. And when God saw how corrupt the earth was and how flesh had corrupted its ways on earth, then he's going to put an end to it. In other words, the disorder is very troubling to the order maker, creator, and therefore in frustration with human sinfulness, which is in a way, plays itself out with disorder. And according to the rabbis, it was sexual, corruption, but also robbery, right, and violence. And that was seen as a kind of, mix of natural order, social order, all in disarray. And that corruption meant that the world needed to be destroyed because it didn't have the framework of structure that could hold it up. So take a look at the language. Now, this language will be important to us as we move forward. In the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, the 17th day of the month, all the fountains of the great deep burst apart and the floodgates of the sky broke open. It doesn't say God brought the flood. What does it say? It says that God had separated the waters above and below, and God just got tired of holding up order and just, like somebody, with his finger, in the dam, pulled it out to just enough already. I can't bear the weight of all this order making. And so everything, all the waters, inundate the planet. And this portrayal of Nivkeu kol mayanot tehom rabav arubot hashamayim yiftachu, everything goes to chaos, support, like, because human beings are not keeping social order. Animals are not keeping natural order. So this idea that the world is not as finished as we think, and that God every day is holding back the waters of chaos and will be undermined if we do not help, is part of a thesis written by, Mary Douglas, I think, speaks of this, as we'll see later too. But there's a Jewish theologian in Harvard, John Levinson, and a Bible scholar who's written a book called Creation and the Persistence of Evil. And he writes that the absolute sovereignty of God is not a simple given in the Hebrew Bible, but instead, Hashem's mastery is often seen as fragile and constant need of reactivation and reassertion. Cosmic order depends upon faithfulness to the divine human covenant. So there are two parts. God's got to be faithful to the covenant, and we do as well. So this is where the rabbis see the challenge of sexual chaos. Yossi uses a metaphor of an eyeball. The generation of the flood becomes haughty due to the covetousness of the eyeball. The covetousness means the desire of the eye. Like we say this in the Shema, it's like, the eye and the heart lust for things that you want. And so this is related to the initial thing we had about excess, but here, not only about the bad behavior, but about the fragility of the world. And so, like the water of the eyeball, which sees what it wants and takes, like the sons of the prominent men, if you remember in Genesis 6:2, the Bnei Elohim take what they want, take whatever they see, whatever they choose. So the water of the eye kind of incites God to punish the world with water, for all flesh had corrupted its way. So now take a look at Rav Yochanan. This teaches that beasts copulated with animals, animals with beasts, all of them with the human women, and the human man with all of them. In other words, the corruption that emerged as a flood was brought about by sex outside of boundaries. And then that's earlier, the Gemara of Rabbi Yossi, you're probably talking about the 500s. Here in Bnei Rabbah, you're talking about a later text, closer to the 800s. Rav Huna, in the name of Rabbi, said, the generation of the flood was not washed away until they wrote nuptial hymns for unions between males. So here you have a very explicit portrayal, is that writing a ketubah, you see it's exactly the language. In another case, it's going to be, in Chulin, it's going to be ketubot. Here it's gemam siot. If you take a look right here, it's gemam siot lezachar. That these are marriage poems. And of course, they wrote them also in Egypt. Not only did men marry men and brothers and sisters marry each other, but there were marriage ceremonies for humans and animals. So they had a cultural way to say this happened, because they did have memory of this happen. And then their claim is that that's what brought the flood. Rabbi Simlai, famous statement that wherever you find licentiousness, sex beyond the ordinary borders, androlamusia, which is a word in Greek for the seizure of men for either, it's corveia for war or for punishment, for collective punishment. So when androlamusia comes, it takes everybody. In other words, and here is the portrayal that is picked up by evangelicals. This is kind of like, what the worst of homophobia in religious garments can do is that gay marriage is what brings a flood. Gay marriage is what brings an earthquake. Gay marriage is what brings, I don't know, horrible consequences of all different sorts. And you find it in Chulin as well, is that the children of Noah accepted 3 commandments that they accepted more, but they really fulfill 3. They don't write ketubot for men. So already you have in the material this concern that certain kinds of sexual behaviors and the legitimation of them. By the way, there were other things that the Chulin text said. So let's read it all. Rav Ula says the children of Noah accepted upon themselves 3 commandments, and they feel, it's 30 commandments, it should say, I think. Shloshim, that's a mistranslation. But they only feel 3. This is, they don't write marriage bills. They do not weigh out human flesh in the market. They're not cannibals. Or even if they are, they eat it privately in their homes. They wouldn't never publicly sell human flesh. And they honor the Torah. Now, you might think that cannibalism and homosexuality have nothing in common. But it appears that they do, at least according to the Maharal. So here's the Maharal. In Chidushei Agadot, writes this on a text in reference specifically to same-sex relations to Mishkav Zachar. He writes the following. There's nothing more hateful and disgusting than male intercourse. So my interest is why, which the scripture calls abomination. And why? Well, there's nothing more abominable than someone that eats flesh of the human dead, cannibalism. Because in a sense, mark this, he eats himself, which is similar to male intercourse because such a man connects to a male like himself. In other words, what is the problem? Why is homosexual sex and cannibalism, why are they in the same page? So the claim is going to be, at least for the Maharal, that they both are taboos that are self-undermining. Why shouldn't you, eat people? Well, it's because it's a kind of self-destruction. And why is homosexual sex problematic? It's because it sexually devours the self. Now, this idea, it's actually fascinating. I don't know if, it would be fun to put him on the couch and have Freud talk to him. But the connection between these two things has made it into a contemporary discussion in Ethics After Babel by Jeffrey Stout, who is a religious studies scholar and legal scholar in Princeton. So his material helps us kind of begin to understand a little bit about the problematics of disorder and why disorder is morally troublesome. Now, he begins this piece with a discussion of cabots. A cabot is a mixture of a rabbit and a cat. Of course, no one's ever really seen it. It's a mythical creature, or it's one you can find in a tabloid. And he describes seeing a cablet in a tabloid and feeling sick to his stomach. And then he claims is that there's something about, there's something about mixtures that are out of the ordinary, that mark a kind of instantiation of disorder and disarray that make us sick, that feel disgusting, that are either laughable or terrorizing or stomach turning. And he claims that these are in the category of moral abomination. And he begins to share why 3 things, cannibalism, bestiality, and he entertains as well homosexuality, are potentially in the category of moral abomination. Moral abomination is not bad because it's wrong in the ordinary way we think of good and evil in regard to benefit and loss. Basically, he says, what's wrong with cannibalism? I mean, the guy is dead and I get lunch. You're not killing somebody, you're just eating dead flesh. So, like, what's the moral trouble? Like, if it's benefit and loss, then there should be no problem. So he describes the problem of cannibalism in this way. He says that the reason cannibalism is problematic is because when you eat human flesh, you are, like the Maharal says, eating yourself and therefore undermining your membership in the class of humans. In other words, cannibalism violates the distinction between human and animal. There are animals, wild ones, vicious ones that eat humans, but if you eat another human, you aren't human. Animals, so that on some level, what it means to belong is to not eat, to not put yourself on the table. And he has this that I put in yellow. What you eat is what you are not. You don't eat yourself. Most societies define themselves in prescribing food in various ways to membership. In violation of food taboos, kind of gets you excluded from society generally. Not every society does this in the same way, but societies do have, there are two things, it's really actually surprising. Sex and diet are places where taboo lives well because they undermine membership. If you eat a certain food that you're not supposed to eat, like, you remember the rhyme of the ancient mariner? They ate the albatross. And it was such a curse to eat an albatross, which was a peaceful bird, that all the people on the ship die. And he shot it, he killed it, and he ate it, and everyone dies. In other words, or the stories of people who forced to, on a lifeboat to eat human flesh, and afterwards go crazy, go mad. So there's something about undoing the self when you eat human flesh. And the truth is that sex has a similar thing. It's like, this is why incest is troublesome, because it's sex that is reviling, because it makes you not a member of a family and ultimately undermines a certain kind of membership. So there's certain things that are not morally troubling. In other words, you can imagine not knowing a partner was a marriage partner, a family member, and then discovering you'd slept with your mother. Oh my God, Oedipus! And then you got to pluck out your eyes. Interesting, the eyes again, right? Because you can't bear because you've undermined the actual structure of sociality and family and relationship. So sexual intercourse with beasts is, like eating human flesh, is beastly. It calls into question your identity. If the shepherd has sex with his flocks, he has shown respect for himself. It makes the actual degrading because the agent seems to be less human. Now, here's the question. Why does he include sodomy, intercourse between men, in the same category? So he claims that sodomy, like bestiality, involves the use of organs that can render one's social identity anomalous, I'm here, or ambiguous. But unlike both bestiality and cannibalism, it doesn't concern the line between human and non-human, right? It's sodomy is more like the bearded woman or the hermaphrodite that messes up the boundary not between animal and human, but the boundary between male and female. And then he claims the following, is that the boundary between animal and human is still morally salient, which is why most societies are reviled by cannibalism. When in a society, the difference between being human and being an animal is so it's so internal to the way we think and feel that it's revolting to discover you ate a piece of flesh, right? If you saw, it works in Jewish frames in softer ways. You remember, recently in Unorthodox, she unknowingly bites into a sandwich and it's ham, and she expects to vomit. because that's the response to in taking into your body what should not be there. It's pollution. By the way, what is pollution? Pollution is things in disorder. It's like, your plastic is all right until it's in the ocean. Things in the wrong place are both corrupting of life and undermining of identity and belonging and order and structure and ultimately life, which is why God can't bear the disorder of the world and wants to destroy it in the flood. The sharper line, and this is the key text for us, because it's the distinction between male and female and the salience, moral salience of that distinction that makes homosexuality really troublesome. So take a look. The sharper line between masculine and feminine roles, the greater the importance. Do you see where I am? Everyone see? I'm down here in the middle of the page, right? The sharper the line between masculine and feminine roles, and the greater the importance of that line in determining such matters, such as the division of labor, the rules of inheritance, the more likely that sodomy will be abominated. If your society defines masculine and feminine roles, as many do, in reference to socially legitimated uses of sexual organs, or functions in shul, or functions on a court, or functions in leadership, then sexual activity of the wrong kind can threaten your claim to a certain role. You become, in effect, a social anomaly, the equivalent of a monster, an object of abomination. The question is not whether homosexuality is intrinsically abominable, but rather, what are the social structures that make it seem like a violation of order, a violation of fundamental structure of what it means to be human, what it means to be in God's ordained, ordered world. Okay. Now, he in the end comes to the conclusion that while moral abomination is still real when it comes to bestiality and cannibalism, it is no longer true in his world that the dividing line between male and female is morally salient, whereas the dividing line between animal and human still is. But that is the question, because it's that question that will lead you to a moral abomination of bestiality and cannibalism, but actually rejecting the moral abomination of homosexuality. Now, the theorist that focuses on this issue in thoughtful Jewish ways as well is Daniel Boyarin, who claims that homosexual violation is parallel to cross-dressing. So I wanted to take at least a little bit of time in focusing on this parallel. In other words, the rationale, no longer reproduction or marriage that get threatened, but the problem is the confusion of gender as a problem in the world, and maybe less so now, but still, what do we do with the problem of cross-dressing, which it appears to be, it's really a problem in the heritage, the religious tradition that we've received, the Masorah. So lo yekli gever alisha v'lo yilbash gever simlat isha. Man, woman should not put on man's apparel, nor should man wear women's clothing. Ki toavat Hashem elokecha kol oseh ele, because it's an abomination of God for anyone to do this. And so one could read this as a very simple, boys do this, girls do that, very similar to the Ibn Ezra, a man is made for penetrating, a woman is made for being penetrated, and to do it the other way, in other words, homosexuality becomes a form of cross-dressing that's worse, because cross-dressing is a wrapper error where anal intercourse is much more fundamental to bodies. So for a man to submit his body as penetrable becomes a undermining of his masculinity and a violation of the orders of creation. One could read it that way. However, it's interesting that Chazal pushed back, not completely, but partially. It was taught in a bright that a man's apparel shall not be on a woman in Nazir, and a man shall not wear a woman's garment. But what does Scripture mean? If it's simply that a man may not wear a woman's garment, a woman may not wear a man's garment, why should the verse refer to the violation as abomination? Well, I mean, the question is an interesting one. Nothing has happened. This text is not assuming that mere confusion is abominable. That is interesting, right? Something else has got to be abominable. What is it? Well, if it's just clothing, then that's not abominable enough to be called a toiva. Rather, the verse means that a man not wear woman's clothes in order to sit among women. A woman may not wear man's clothes in order to sit among men. In other words, changing your garb in order to sit among the other gender for a sexual escapade. In other words, abomination needs to be there. It needs to be again, a problem of sexual licentiousness, not merely a category. Category error in this text is much less their concern. Their concern is the man dressing up as a woman in order to sneak in to the girls' locker room? By the way, not surprising that in an attempt to create justice for transgender people, the boogaboo fear is just that. Men dressing up as women, not because of any other rationale other than one in order to find an escapade, is threatening women in the locker room, or, potentially a woman dressing up as a man in order to have a sexual escapade of her own, less threatening to the men, but nonetheless. So there's more to say here. I don't want to go into great detail, but there is a Rambam that, interestingly enough, he doesn't claim what we would be worried about, that cross-dressing is a problem of gender order. He says, no, it's just that women would put on armor when they stood before Mars, and men would put on women's clothing when they stood in front of Venus. In other words, it was a form of idolatry. The only thing I will say is that already, as the Renaissance gets close, so you find recognition that there's a category of not only women who dress up as men for their own sexual escapades with men, and not only men who dress up as women for their own sexual escapades with women, but for the first time, men dressing up as women for sexual escapades with men. And that you find in the Abravanel. He does say that married women now want to be taken up with their passions, and they dress up in their husband's clothing in order to go out not noticed and fool around with the men. And they go to the bar and they hang out, and they whisper in some man's ear, I look like Joe, but I'm really Josephine, let's go. And she gets access to who she wants, right? So that's our typical worry, a worry of promiscuity. Here, though, and men who seek sex with men, Mishkav Zachur, will dress up in women's clothes to appear like them, to arouse feelings of lust. So in other words, there's already an awareness that there's a cultural reality of men cross-dressing, not for the sake of sexual escapades with women, for the sake of sexual escapades with men. Okay. I want to take a minute to stop and see if there are any questions, because the next piece is very different, and I want to kind of give room for it, but I want to see if there are any questions. So I'm gonna stop the share for now and see if there are any thoughts in the chat, and we can come back to mixtures in a minute.
Okay, so there's actually one question and comment. Are there sources for the rabbis defining the chaos as sexual disorder and not just social disorder, or is it their own ideas? I guess this is actually a more general question of the Gemara. Is it the rabbi's own explanations, or is it based on something?
Well, so if I understand your question correctly, and Heidi, you can clarify if you want, that I'm not doing it if I'm not getting it right. But I think the rabbis, as we're going to see soon, were aware that the world is less than the structures in the system reveal. And so uh, they they are nervous about human beings making it worse, but they recognize that there's less order than it might be, than even the Torah recognizes. For example, they, as we'll see, um, theorize the existence of an androgynous, a hermaphrodite, or a tuntum, someone whose gender is unknown, or an Ilonite, a female that is not so feminine. And so their having seen it, I think, highlights the reality that they're struggling to deal with a complex and more disordered world than they like, and they're trying to make thoughtful moral room for it. So I think that they, in a sense, they're coming up with categories that the Bible doesn't come up with. The Bible doesn't talk about, like, various forms of trans experience or hermaphrodism, but they do. And when you could claim that the Bible is aware of different kinds of masculinity, and that, Jenny Boryarin makes a big deal of, and others do as well, is that Jewish men are softer and less violent. And so there's that. Women in the Hebrew Bible, at least in some places, take very strong, almost male action. Dvorah is, a general. Yael kills a man with a peg. It's quite phallic. So they did see frames where individuals, for good reason, and maybe, even significant individuals like Yaakov or Yosef, had gender bending realities. So I don't know, where that takes us, but I think that they were responding both to textual experiences, but mostly to the reality around them that was more complex.
So now there's another question. Is there any element of this revulsion against male-male sodomy because anal sex potentially puts the penis in contact with bodily waste products? Is the gender role revulsion a secondary consideration?
So I always thought, when I first explored this for myself, that might have been the problem, but you find it nowhere. So much so that the rabbis permit anal intercourse with a wife. So they're, as much as Tuma and Tara, impurity played a role, and they surely, had rules of covering, excrement, but that doesn't appear, interestingly enough, and one might think it could, but it doesn't. We already started a little bit with mixtures, and now we're going to get into it. So there's much more to be explored here, and we're going to do some of that when we have the opportunity to speak with Joy next week. But it's clear that, as I said, the Bible has only two categories, male and female, and I often ask rabbis, how many sexes are in the Torah and how many sexes do the rabbis see, and then how could they invent a sex not in the Torah? And the answer is they saw it. So, in Mishnah Bikurim, it's famous and it's got more detail than this, but the detail's not so helpful for us now. But, androgynous, yesh bo drachim shaveh l'anashim, v'yesh bo drachim shaveh l'nashim, a hermaphrodite, which is someone with both genitalia, is treated some ways like men, in some ways like women. In other ways, he is like men and women both, in other ways like neither. And they follow through in, kind of excruciating detail in Bikurim with exactly what mitzvot might, how mitzvot might have to be addressed. And often the male reality, the existence of a penis, overshadows the existence of a vagina as a reality, which is not uncommon in more patriarchal frames. But still, they're making room for double physical reality, not emotional reality. That's not on the table at this point. Rabbi Meir says in the end of Bikurim, in Mishnah 4 of that chapter 4, that the androgynous is a beria bifnei atzma. Now, it's quite remarkable because it's really the invention of a unique sex that then requires the rabbi to do a lot of work, which means to say the following, that they're accepting that sin is not the cause of disorder. It's just unique. And in fact, as you know, there's a bracha for unique creatures, and so uniqueness and out of the ordinariness is lauded by the rabbis. They, I might have included this text in retrospect. It might have been good to have it, but I'll just remind you of it. Is that there are two separate brachot. If you see a person whose uniqueness is from birth and is the way they were made, you tend not to see it as calamitous, and therefore you say, the bracha on the uniqueness of this creature, and it's a bracha of shevach. The bracha that you say when you see a person who lost their eyesight or who had a calamity and is impaired in some way later in life, you say Baruch Dayan Emet, and you say it quietly. So they're struggling to discern between difference that's painful and difference that's endemic to reality, and therefore not painful, actually a piece of God's magnificent and colorful creation. I want to end with this text. I use this text typically with teenagers all the time to start a conversation around homosexuality that feels safe to educators. And it's about difference in general and how it's portrayed. So, Tanu Rabbanan Maaseh be'echad shemeita ishto v'hinika ben linok. There was a man whose wife died and she left him an infant to suckle. V'lo hayalo schar minika liten, and he didn't have the money to pay a wet nurse. V'na'asa lo nes v'niftechu lo dadim kishnei dadei isha. And a miracle occurred and he grew to breasts like the breasts of a woman. And he nursed his child. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, Bo'urei kama gadol adam zeh. Come and see how great this man is. Shena'aseh lo nes kazeh. That such a miracle was performed for him. Amar lo Abaye. Abaye said, Adarabba, all the opposite. Kama garu adam zeh. How wicked, how debased this man must have been. Shenishtanu lo sidrei veshit. That the orders of creation, look at that word, it's right there jumping out at you, were changed, were contorted, were corrupted. So the question I ask teenagers is, so I love this text because, it's problematic and in so helps us think through our complex emotions around difference. Is a man with breasts a wonder like Rav Yosef, or a monster like Abaye? Or is a gay person a wonder like Rav Yosef, or a monster like Abaye? In fact, what kind of differences scare us so much that we think of them as monstrous? And what kind of differences we discover in time to be wondrous? The challenge of this material is that it offers us a portrayal of homosexuality as a threat to order if you need that order profoundly, and it makes your world feel navigable. And it's not surprising that either trans people or gay people or gender fluid people are perceived in systems that require them, that require highly demarcated frames of male and female identity, seem as monsters. And what is the process by which, instead of yelling at them, we figure out how to move as as Stout says, from a legitimate moral abomination to a sensibility that the gray in between is not frightening, but the way the world is. Chana Pinchasi once said, in Israel, I was on my book came out in Hebrew, and I did a number of book events around the country. And she came to one and she said, Steve, the reason this is interesting to me is because some people take boundaries, binaries, and want to claim that we need to protect them. And other people claim we need to overturn them. And it seems like what you're claiming is that we need to do something else. We don't need to overturn them, but there can't be a tripwire between them. There's got to be a gradient. There is such a thing as a man and a woman, but there's a gradient of gray that needs to be sustained as a space that's real and human. And if we can come up with a way to calm down the terror that the absence of a gradient means that there's no map, we can actually change the world. Okay, and with that,
so there's so there's a comment in the chat that Joshua is saying we need to transcend them. So that's just an addition, I think, to what you were just saying. But also that in laying out the story that's described, this is described as a miracle, the man who grew breasts to breastfeed. Unless that's a value-free term, it seems like the story is cast in terms that favor Rabbi Yosef over Rabbi Abaye. So
it seems that it's, well, look, they're not the end all of this conversation. They inaugurate our response. Steve did a play about deaf folks. He had to learn to do sign language. And he was brought into a world in which cochlear implants were abominable. And so, we're struggling in a world where the map is being questioned, and there are for some, it's being overturned, and for others, it's being defended. And so, the real question, is giving people who are, who have problems with hearing choice. The challenge is that what do you do when you have to actually make that choice early on in life? How do we manage hermaphrodism and can we, imposing it is not great, but on the other hand, how do we not, provide hormone blockers for a child who's feeling that their body is undermining their soul? So we're in a space that is not easy to navigate and is creative and difficult, and really important for us to dive in really with thoughtfulness and calm and patience. And it's, in the end, I relinquish here my voice to a great extent because I am happily male, cisgendered, and which is why I didn't want to do this series without specifically on this issue, without speaking to Joy or to somebody for whom the experience is one that is, from within. And so I hope that we can address that. I see that Joshua said that deaf people, there's a thought that you can put in and teach a child this language. Well, you can offer both. It's true. But part of the challenge is that if you put the cochlear implant in early, then the child never learns sign language and functions in hearing society, and therefore doesn't develop the sociality of the other language. And so it's complicated. It's a complicated question. There's no easy answer, because the decisions you make early in life will, and is it fair to deprive deaf people of that living, language that won't be as living if you give them a cochlear implant, and yet can you deprive them of hearing? So I think that the moral questions are still alive and not easily solvable. And I think that on some level, what this rationale does is it pushes us into a space where we get discourse with at least some understanding of the fear people have around gay LGBT people. Is that we begin to get, because none of us would want a world without boundaries. So the question is, how do we make sure, for example, that there is such a thing as a Jew and a Gentile, but not such a thing as a black person and a white person? You understand? Like, we want some boundaries. We love them. We love our Jewish, non-Jewish boundary. We don't want to blow it up. And there are those on the left that do want to blow up that boundary, right? They want to say a Jew is someone who says they're a Jew. You don't need a ceremony, you don't need belief, and you don't need a mikvah, and you just need to say you are. And so I just want to put on the table that this is all over the world, is trying to figure out what does it mean to belong, and how do we manage boundaries, their necessity and their problematic.